It's my pleasure to introduce Clint Burnham to you here today. I first met Clint back in 1998 when he was an English sessional instructor at UBC and was involved in a program at UBC just across the street here in the old Orr Gallery when it used to be at 112 West Hastings. He teaches in the Department of English at SFU now. He's a founding member of the Lacan Salon. His writings on art have appeared in journals, catalog essays, and online media in Canada, the US, and Europe. His latest books include The Only Poetry That Matters, Reading the Kootenai School of Writing by Arsenal Pulp Press, and co-edited with Paul Boudra, From Text to Texting, New Media in the Classroom. He's presently writing a book about Slavoj Žižek and photography. I ask you to join me in welcoming Clint Burnham.
Thank you, Am. I want to begin by acknowledging crucial research assistance in this project from the SFU Fine Arts librarian, Sylvia Roberts, not merely as a professional courtesy, but also in solidarity with CUPE Local 3338, which represents 1,200 employees at SFU, including the clerical staff in my department, and I believe the people who set up this technology tonight. And also the librarians who staged a picket last Wednesday at the Burnaby campus. CUPE has been without a contract for 2 years. In the same regard, and no less related to the increasingly neoliberalized economics of post-secondary education, the TSSU, which represents TAs and sessional instructors, has also instituted an overtime ban. Again, the work that TAs and TMs and sessionals do in the university is vital, underpaid, and without proper security. And as Am mentioned, when we met, I was a sessional at UBC, which I was sessional at UBC, CAP, and Emily Carr's, everywhere except where I eventually got the tenure job. So I don't know if that's a good or bad sort of career path, but I did that for about 10 years. Oh, this quote here, of course, is from Walter Benjamin. In a similar autobiographical gesture, I want to show as my first image from Burtynsky's Oil series a shot of a pipeline going through the arboreal forest near Cold Lake, Alberta. In descriptions of this photograph, writers fall into a common fallacy. Thus, Paul Roth, senior curator at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., writes that, quote, in one image we see a pipeline directing recovery from the oil sands of Alberta, Canada, through a clearing in a forest. Its sinuous channel follows the contours of the woods. Only on a second glance do we realize the tree line has been reshaped, altered by the placement of the conduit. Honoring the Herculean effort that brings energy to the surface, nature bends to our will. And that's from Burtynsky's Oil book, which also is an iPad app. So. But also Laurie Pauly, curator at the National Gallery of Canada, describes how, quote, in photographs of oil fields in northern Alberta, ungainly metal pipes snake their way through otherwise pristine northern meadows. And that's from the book Manufactured Landscapes. Unfortunately, these northern meadows are not quite the pristine landscape, only reshaped by big oil. I lived in Cold Lake from 1975 to 1978 because my father was in the Air Force and because it is also the site of the largest air weapons test range in North America. Some 11,000 square kilometers, operational since the 1950s, notorious in the 1980s as the site of cruise missile tests, but even before that of various NORAD tests called Operation Maple Flag. And the target of the international peace movement, at least in the 1980s, which is to say that the landscape was already a colonized and militarized space before tar sands operations began in 1980. So it is by way of a political introduction. So this was by way of a political introduction, and I want to turn now to Walter Benjamin's Little History of Photography essay. In part because here Benjamin develops, as it were, the concept of aura in a strictly photographic context. And I would like to situate my reading of Benjamin, of how he discusses aura, but also the optical unconscious, in precisely the genre of art criticism, but without ever forgetting the role of the social. So this is a sort of double Dutch of dialectics, which I actually gave an early version of this paper in Holland, so I had to throw in the most offensive. Dutch uncle, apparently they don't like either. Or going Dutch, you know, they're kind of, no Dutch people here. So a double Dutch of dialectics. A dialectics first of genre, not just art criticism, but the attempt to sum up a history of photography, a genre that is also a history, and then, or also, the dialectics of the social, a situating of aesthetic paradigms in history. There is then a tension between these formal dialectics as well as between the oral and the optical. Sorry, I lost my, okay. As well as between oral and the optical unconscious. I then ditch momentarily these concerns for the contemporary photographer Edward Burtynsky, looking at how the sublime functions both in the critical, which is quite often uncritical, reception of his work, but nonetheless as a tool to understand how we can make such stunning photographs, banal for all that, of environmental waste on a gargantuan scale. I then turn to how Slavoj Žižek has discussed the sublime in some of his works, which approach in scale that of Burtynsky's, which is to say as some form of the Lacanian real or jouissance. That is, Žižek's sublime, as argued throughout his work, varies from a version of the Kantian aesthetic sublime, that which in nature especially discombobulates our cognitive faculties, and the more properly Lacanian sublime of das Ding, the thing, or the object petit. So the sublime is for Žižek, although he never argues such, a dialectical sublime, an antagonistic sublime, in a way similar to that dialectic of the aura, which some critics have argued in terms of a Kantian genealogy, and the optical unconscious in Benjamin. And with Burtynsky then, the problem is not so much a non-dialectical sublime, but rather one that is merely a middle-brow Kant, one that is all aura, no unconscious. That was sort of a conclusion I had back in May, and then I've sort of more recently tried to complicate this, to trouble this, which it seemed to be a bit too pat. So Benjamin's Little History of Photography essay was first published in Die Literarische Welt in 1931. If this is where he continues to work out the term aura, the critic Miriam Hansen traces the roots of that term in Benjamin's work back to his hashish protocols. You would see these auras on people. It is also here that he introduces the optical unconscious, in a passage so rich for the history of photographic criticism that I hope you will forgive me quoting it at length. Benjamin is discussing Karl Dotende's photograph of, quote, the father of the poet, and his wife, the latter of whom will go on to commit suicide. So this now is Benjamin. No matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible urge to search such a picture for the tiny spark of contingency, of the here and now, with which reality has, so to speak, seared the subject, to find the inconspicuous spot where in the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment, the future nests so eloquently that we, looking back, may rediscover it. For it is another nature that speaks to the camera rather than to the eye. Other, above all, in the sense that a space informed by human consciousness gives way to a space informed by the unconscious. Whereas it is commonplace that, for example, we have some idea what is involved in the act of walking, if only in general terms, we have no idea at all what happens during the fraction of a second when a person actually takes a step. Photography, with its devices of slow motion and enlargement, reveals the secret. It is through photography that we first discover the existence of this optical unconscious, just as we discover the instinctual unconscious through psychoanalysis. What one notices, first of all, in this declaration is the way Benjamin here formulates what Roland Barthes will later call the punctum, that, as Benjamin puts it, tiny spark of contingency, of the here and now, which evades the will of the photographer, no matter how artful. For Barthes, the punctum was often just a way to assert the sovereignty of the viewer. It was what he would find. But for Benjamin, that contingency is also marked by the here and now, a historical marking that is also indeterminate, perhaps, since it is perhaps both the now of the photograph's making and, later, of a knowledge brought to the picture by the viewer, that the woman would go on to commit suicide, for instance. But that inconspicuous spot is where, for Benjamin, the future nests so eloquently. that we can rediscover it, which formulation also can perhaps be thought of in terms of Benjamin's messianic time, that retroactive, or as Freud put it, nectraglic understanding of the photograph only possible at a later time. We can't look at the photograph at the time of its taking and know that this woman is going to commit suicide, but when we know the woman is going to commit suicide, we can then see it in the photograph. Benjamin's concept is more social than Roland Barthes and perhaps more historical. But it is social and psychoanalytic, to be sure. The camera speaks, and it does speak for Benjamin, just as the future is so eloquent, not to the eye, but to the unconscious, or at least, as he puts it, to a space formed by the unconscious. It is by way of developing this concept, or giving an example, that Benjamin first argues that we have no idea what goes on when someone takes a step, and that photography, via its technology, can reveal this secret, can reveal the existence of an optical unconscious, just as psychoanalysis did for the instincts. I want to come back later to this footstep, to this footstep as a photographic sign, perhaps. Actually, I want it so much I haven't yet. But Burtynsky and also these other photographers that I was going to talk about, but I don't get to, Mandel and Sultan, all have these very interesting photographs of footprints or footsteps. But I want to first think about the optical unconscious. The art historian Rosalind Krauss takes up that phrase in her book of the same name as a generally psychoanalytic way of viewing a counter-history of modernism, but she also has some troubles with its use in Benjamin. On the one hand, she agrees the powerful and dispassionate eye of the camera can detect the unseen visual data analogous to lapses and parapraxis or Freudian slips that betray the unconscious. But what is there, she asks, in the visual field itself that what is there, she asks, in the visual field itself that a sentient being with a structure or space in conflict with its consciousness? To be sure, Krauss is correct in that the visual field, the world which we see, is not itself inherently sentient or possessing an unconscious. And in some ways, Benjamin's examples, the gait of a person or a horse, as we might see in an Edward Muybridge photograph, or Karl Blossfeldt's botanical pictures, are more structural than structuralist. And Benjamin's optical unconscious is resolutely a matter of desire, of the dialectics of desire. First of all, this concept is developed as a way of distinguishing photography, and especially photography of anonymous subjects, as Rancière will stress, of distinguishing photography from painting. Thus Benjamin notes the following about David Octavius Hill's well-known photograph of the New Haven fishwife. We encounter something new and strange, something that goes beyond testimony to the photographer's art, something that cannot be silenced, that fills you with an unruly desire to know what her name was, the woman who was alive there, who even now is still real and will never consent to be wholly absorbed in art. For Benjamin, the ladies' man, this may have been a gender desire, but I think it is also the real of desire, the real of the optical unconscious, that is apparent no less in the antagonism with painting. And it is worth noting that this photographer, Octavius Hill, was at the time merely taking photographs for his paintings. Like many non-art historians, I found this image online on Flickr, and Gwenny P. Wrote this on Flickr. I love this. It would be great to see more photos of women from this time, see what their lives were like. A comment that for me is important for both for how it brings photography into the digital, but also confirms Benjamin's argument that this photograph will not be absorbed into art and troubles the gender politics of what he's doing as well. But perhaps this does not answer Krauss's objection that Benjamin is just being too poetic in attributing an unconscious to the world. Here we might turn to the other well-known idea that Benjamin was developing in the 1930s, that of the aura and what the photograph does to the aura. And I use the term developing advisedly, for Benjamin introduces the concept with specific reference, first of all, to the technical history of photography. From the stock still sitting for daguerreotypes, which, to quote Benjamin, caused the subject to focus his life in the moment. Everything in these pictures was built to last. To the commercialization of portrait photography in the late 19th century. There was a social history where not only did the aura come from the technical limitations of the mid-century work of David Octavius Hill or Nadar, but also from the meeting in the studio of what Benjamin calls a technician of the latest school with, quote, a member of a rising class, equipped with an aura that seeped into the very folds of the man's frock coat or flappy cravat. A, quote, aura that was by no means the mere product of a primitive camera, but rather because this was a brief moment when subject and technique were exactly congruent. So this is a specifically materialist account of aura, one rooted in the dialectics of class relations, rather than the more theological readings that many critics of Benjamin, including Miriam Hansen, Shep Steiner, or David Ferris, will bring to Benjamin. But I think my reading is faithful to the essay, for Benjamin will then argue that just as technological advances in lenses and production rendered the aura invisible, photographers began to simulate the same in the so-called pictorialist era of artistic photography. Quote, exactly as aura was being banished from reality by the deepening degeneration of the imperialist bourgeoisie. That is to say, the pictorialists' fetish of the aura was all their fake tricks they would do. There was a show a couple of years ago at the Vancouver Art Gallery that showed a lot of this work. The pictorialists' fetish of the aura, it's the Instagram of the turn of the 20th century. That's all you need to know. So, the quick and dirty version. And same thing now with fake polaroidization of photography, right? Digital is too cold. So the pictorialists' fetish of the aura was a matter of an imaginary resolution to the real contradiction of the change in the dialectical relationship between the photographer and his or her technology and the bourgeois subject. So it is the aura of the photograph itself, its appearance of aura with early 19th century portraits, its disappearance with technical innovation, and then its simulation with the pictorialists, that first is worked out, this concept, in Benjamin's essay here, and which then underwrites the better-known development of aura in the Little History of Photography, as well as his Artwork in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction essay, when Benjamin first of all compares aura to the phenomenal halo of light around a far-off mountaintop or tree's branch, and then to photography's work in bringing images of far-off places closer to the masses, the destruction of the aura. But again, Benjamin grounds this discussion in a specific passage of photographic criticism. His discussion of Atget, whose work he argues, the French photographer whose work he argues, quote, initiates the emancipation of object from aura, whose pictures, he writes in an odd image, suck the aura out of reality like water from a sinking ship. The first phrase makes sense if we think of Benjamin, suck the aura out of reality, if we think of Benjamin's dialectical narrative of photography and capitalism. Atget's photographs in their straight presentation of the street, like the scene of a crime in Benjamin's memorable phrase, liberate the street and other objects in the image from the pictorialist's lamentable aestheticization. But what does it mean not only to suck aura, and not only out of reality, we are back in Rosalind Krauss's dilemma, but like water from a ship? Does water suck from a ship? Here too, Benjamin is being specific. Atget's pictures of Parisian streets take the aura out of the scene in that they signal a break with the pictorialist aesthetic. They remove only what was added, the aura as remainder, as object petit a, via what Jacques Rancière in the Politics of the Aesthetic calls the appropriation of the commonplace. In a well-known aphorism in the Passagenwerk in the Arcades Project, Benjamin offers a characterization of, quote, the Marxist theory of art, one moment swaggering and the next scholastic. Now, Margaret Cohen has argued that these lines are evidence of Benjamin's dissatisfaction with existing Marxist aesthetics, but I think it is possible to read a bit of envy or emulation, or perhaps even desire, if not even one of those typical moments in the Arcades Project where Benjamin is also talking about his own work. Swaggering scholasticism indeed, another dialectic. In my reading of the Little History, I have argued that Benjamin's concepts of art come out of the history of photography, and that history of the form is itself social, and how we can think of that relation between the concept and the history on the one hand, and the history on the social on the other, in terms of these dialectics. But for this to work, we also need to think about the sublime, and how the sublime in the visual field can be thought of as the return of the aura. so this is a pretty crude transition, but I just really haven't come up with a better one. So from 1931 to photography of the 90s and 2000s. At any rate, so Burtynsky, books and gallery shows around the globe, TED Prize and talk, the ultimate mark of the bourgeois middle brow is to give a TED talk, I suppose, in 2005. As I mentioned to somebody earlier, an iPhone or iPad app. So the contemporary photographer whose work is most often, or at least very often, thought of in terms of the sublime is Edward Burtynsky. Just a cursory survey of the criticism of his work, journalistic for the most part, very little actually scholarly or academic or art historical writing on his work, reveals the word sublime is sprinkled through reviews like semicolons. 3 times in a gushing 2004 review by the usually more rigorous Tom McDonough in Art in America, referencing in particular the romantic sublime and awe or terror. As many or more times in a Canadian art profile from the year before, from 2003, by Gary Michael Dalt. Quote, if what we see in the photograph is more than we could see otherwise, the experience is thrillingly, exhilaratingly fearsome in its sudden, awful, vertiginous clarities. British art historian and author of Militant Modernism, Owen Hatherley, discusses the petroleum sublime in Burtynsky's Oil in Frieze magazine. Another critic writes that Burtynsky's sense of the sublime draws on the Californian landscape tradition, including the work of Ansel Adams, Carlton Watkins, and Robert Misrak. In the same journal, we read of Edward Burtynsky's negative sublime. Laurie Pauly, in the Manufactured Landscape book, connects Burtynsky to the new topographic photographers of the 1970s, but also notes that, quote, bizarre and otherworldly, the landscape of Mount St. Helens challenged these photographers, Burtynsky, Emma Gowan, Frank Golke, to discover the element of the sublime in the devastated terrain. We read discussions of the technological sublime and the toxic sublime, but also in Burtynsky's own words about his own work as an inverted sublime. In 2009, Diana Nemiroff of the National Gallery of Canada, I think the Carleton Art Museum, argued that unlike a social activist reading of the ecological truth of a Burtynsky photograph, an art historian will complicate the image by highlighting its sublime beauty. Finally, an exhibition recently touring Utah and Nashville museums is called The Industrial Sublime and begins with a quote from Edmund Burke. As the Burke or Romantic references suggest, the sublime in Burtynsky criticism suggests the ability of his photographs in their depiction of man-made ruin to nonetheless affect viewers. So let us try to see more specifically, whether formally, thematically, structurally, or contextually, what is sublime about the photographs. First, as mentioned, their very size. Burtynsky has owned a photo processing lab, Toronto Imageworks, since the 1980s, for, he said, the very purpose of producing on a monumental scale. He uses 4x5-inch sheet film that he develops into prints that are 50 by 60 inches or even larger. In this regard, of course, Burtynsky is nothing other than utterly typical of contemporary fine art photographic production. From Jeff Wall's museum-sized photographs of Afghani war dead or white trash racists, to Stan Douglas's transparent mural of a hippie riot in downtown Vancouver, from Andreas Gursky's photographs of shipyards and dollar stores, and Thomas Struth's of art museums and stock exchanges. I should add in defense, if he needs my defense, of Douglas's picture. I'm working on an essay on Žižek and gentrification and that picture. Douglas's Gastown riot picture, the Gastown riot being what Badiou in his new book, The Rebirth of History, would call an immediate riot, one that is spatially confined and of little historical importance. But what is interesting about that picture is that unlike the canon of Wall or Gursky, and I don't know all of Douglas's work, but it's one of the few that are certainly that size, but even he doesn't really do a lot of really big pictures. That while it is museum-sized, it is not in a museum. Rather, it is in a public space, or, well, not simply in a public space, but marking a limit between a public and a private space. Perhaps what in neoliberal jargon we could call P3 art, or public-private partnership art. And when I was walking through the atrium just now, which closes, of course, at 10, so you can't see it from inside the atrium after 10, but the proper view is from outside the atrium. So in a sense, so that's, you know, the popular thing. But the second sublime criteria after the size of the prints comes from his subject matter, particularly that of the past 10 years when he's been shooting quarries, shipbreaking, Chinese factories, fields of oil derricks. By this I mean, of course, the scale of his work and how that further contorts or enfolds an admixture of the aesthetic and the repulsive. So tailing streams in northern Ontario look beautiful, but as one critic argues, only if we do not think too hard about the chemical and ecological reality. But presumably, and even though Burtynsky's imagery has a great deal of traction on the environmental left, I gave it another version, and I do keep changing them, so you're not just getting something rehashed here, of this paper at a Petrocultures conference in Edmonton in September. And a lot of the people, when I would tell them I'm talking about Burtynsky, they go, "Oh, great, I love, isn't he?" You know, and so on. So even though it has a great deal of traction on the environmental left, it would not succeed so well in the art world if it was not possible to stop thinking about those chemical and ecological realities. So how does this happen? I would argue that this final aspect of the sublime nature of Burtynsky's photographs, which constitutes or builds towards its recycling, as it were, of Benjaminian aura, is due as well to his point of view, to the frequently, and especially more frequently over the past 10 years, use of an elevated position, a God's eye, or at least crane shot eye, POV. Here Burtynsky is very frank. This is from interviews. "I don't want to have any restrictions as to where the camera can be. It is an interesting way to engage because you literally release yourself from gravity. If I want to be 30 feet up, I'll be 30 feet up, or 100 feet, or 200 feet. I've totally liberated myself from the limits of a point of view." Thus, we have the same technique, very self-consciously connecting both a photograph of workers in a Chinese factory, and I don't know if anyone has seen the film Manufactured Landscape as well, but it's very interesting because, well, oh, I can do this. While he is, and I'll even, how's my pointer thing go? Is that, no, it doesn't matter. Laser point. But while this shot was being set up, has anyone seen the documentary? While the shot is being set up, there's a great tracking shot at the beginning, but then when the shot itself is being set up, these are all workers in these factories, and the camera is down there, and the documentary makers are very pro Burtynsky, but what it turns out is that, like, when they're waiting for him to get the shot, he's up on the crane or the scaffolding or whatever, right? The shift bosses are giving the workers hell for poor production quality. So it's like this, it's just a continuation of the exploitation of the workers out there instead of in the factory itself. So it's very bizarre. But there's also a very good discussion of the neo-Orientalist implications of this photograph and of the photographs of Chinese factories and Three Gorges Dam and so on, as well as the in both the film and in Burtynsky's photographs by Patricia Chen and Xiaobei Henry in a 2009 essay, drawing in part on comments from Chinese bloggers about Burtynsky's work. And they make the comment how the bloggers had never seen, at that point, this article came out in 2009. It's from, I think, a discussion in 2008 or 7 at Carleton. But at that point, Burtynsky's work had actually not been shown in China, although it was of China. So the bloggers would only have seen it online. And again, I have to say that, you know, I have to like the fact that Burtynsky's entire oeuvre is online. And so it's very easy to do screen grabs and, you know, show the pictures. And there's probably some intellectual property thing. But anyway, so he has this very this very same technique of this crane shot, very self-consciously connecting this photograph of workers in a Chinese factory to shots of a biker rally in Sturgis, South Dakota, which is the big sort of Hell's Angels-ish, or should I have touched the thing? If I touch that, there we go. Okay. But you know, it's like he doesn't know what works in his own work. I mean, this has great, you know, Leni Riefenstahl kind of, you know, neoliberal fascist sort of overtones, and this, I mean, my dad could take this picture, right? You know, like it doesn't really work. In another interview, Burtynsky continues with this theme of release from the earth, or at least the desire for height. He writes, he says, I often devise my shooting strategy using topographical maps. There you go, Jason. I look for roads that will take me to high vantage points. And indeed, it is with respect to this very fantasy of liberation, corresponding to the viewer's presumed fetishistic disavowal of his or her role in the environmental disasters, that art journalism unwittingly raises the very problems or Achilles heel of the artwork in the act of praising it. I have a footnote here that's like 10 lines long with a bunch of Freudian German, but just, I'll avoid that one out of kindness. You can ask me during the Q&A. That is to say, for Gary Michael Dalt, for example, the Toronto art journalist, the power, the greatness of Burtynsky's photographs lie in how they offer the viewer a privileged gaze on the despoilation of nature. Quote, he writes, what we see in the photograph is more than we could see otherwise. So this is what the optical unconscious has been reduced to. And interviews with Burtynsky, including that of Dalt in the Manufactured Landscape book and film, disavow any politics or didacticism on his part. Quote, I'm not trying to editorialize and say this is right or this is wrong. Either extreme is simplistic. We are compelled to progress. And later, this is what it is. Or this is not an indictment of the industry. And in the TED Talk, I have to admit, the film, I could only watch about half an hour of it. The TED Talk, 5 minutes, it was just so banal. But in the first 5 minutes of the TED Talk, he's saying how he really likes the corporations because they all give him access. And so like this is something I put on Facebook when I was at the Petroleum Conference at Edmonton. All these other artists saying how difficult it is to get shots of Fort Mac, Fort McMurray, the tar sands and so on, but Burtynsky can get the shots, right? Because, why? Because, well, why? I won't answer my own question. But Burtynsky, like his viewers, can have it both ways. Quote, I'm one of the foot soldiers in the fight for sustainability. And now critics have more recently begun to articulate the spatial distance in Burtynsky's photographs perform an ideological cordon sanitaire that is surely susceptible to an orientalist or post-colonial critique, a charge unwittingly affirmed by the photographer in the following statement. I'm sure the workers, now talking about photographs he took in Bangladesh, I'm sure the workers had never had a photographer like this in their midst. In that gaze across this space, I was reminded in a way of 19th century exploration, standing, looking at a culture, revealing itself to you. And I don't mean to be hard on Burtynsky, because I think actually his unwitting sort of playing into my hands, as it were, is, I think, just the other side of misguided artists who will babble on with some neo-Marxist, feminist, post-colonial rhetoric, but it's still art that's going to sell for X number of dollars, right? So the ideologies are similarly self-deluding. But let us return to this critical keyword in Burtynskyology, the sublime. Are his photographs really sublime? Do we feel such a horrific fear of dismemberment or lack of subjectivity? Do we feel a breakdown in Kantian categories? Or is our reaction closer to the Burkean notion of a distance from the fright or horror of environmental disaster that enables the sublime? In many ways, what happens in the discourse around Burtynsky's photographs is a gentrification of the sublime, and this may even be discernible in the need for that criticism to police our reactions, to disavow any political or moral reading on the one hand, or pro-capitalism on the other. That's a very common theme in the work itself. It's not political because that would be propaganda. It's not apologist for the corporations. A gentrification of the sublime, where that word, sublime, is a soft sell for the paradox of seeing beautiful objects made out of horrible scenes, along with the middlebrow notion of the sublime as actually just more beautiful, awe-inspiring, or the neoliberal catchphrase du jour, awesome. I should add, too, that talking today with Amy Kazmarchuk of Vivo, she reminded me of a recent discussion there where Randy Lee Cutler discussed the capitalist sublime, a notion that comes up in both Leotard and in Jameson. But even if Burtynsky's work is some kind of sublime, a middle-brow sublime, how does this relate to Benjamin's optical unconscious and the aura? If for Benjamin the optical unconscious was a result of how photography revealed the physical world, eliciting our desire or scopophilia, our desire to see, our pleasure in seeing, and if aura was what the photograph in the hands of the right photographer removed from the world, Then in Burtynsky's work, aura is fully restored, and indeed there is no optical unconscious. Rather, his work seeks to protect us from the optical unconscious via that gentrification of the sublime. But of course, I am talking about the sublime in Burtynsky not only because this is how he and his apologists discuss his work. The term has had special importance for Slavoj Žižek in his mashup of Lacan and Kant since, well, The Sublime Object of Ideology, published in 1989. But before I turn to this third part of my paper, oh no, I'm going to skip over that part. Okay, yeah. It's something I talked about with you years ago, Kyle, just about how, well, anyway, when I'm looking up, when I want to write about Žižek, the first thing I do is Google the phrase, and then I find the Google book or whatever, or something on Lacan.com or whatever, and then I find it in one of his books. And so that kind of, which totally makes sense because that's how Žižek works these days, right? His works circulate, they repeat themselves again and again. I'm working on an essay about him in terms of the internet. And even like this week, his podcast for The Current, where he discusses his latest book, The Year of Dreaming Dangerously, right? So that's how we consume. He's not a philosopher of the book, he's a philosopher of the meme, of 4chan, of trolling, of the internet. So that's, he tells rape jokes, that's 4chan, that's pure 4chan, right? That's exactly where it is. Okay, so I do want to quickly point out how Žižek develops in his texts a dialectical sublime, beginning with a sublime object of ideology, where, quote, the sublime object refers to Lacan's seventh seminar as an ordinary object raised to the dignity of the thing. Žižek's example is the Titanic shipwreck, and of course this is 1989, so it's before the movie. But also, of course, in terms of Kantian theory of a threat to one's cognitive capacities, an antagonism where the sublime object, the object A being the more familiar term of Lacan's thing or das Ding, so they're all kind of interchangeable, sublime object, thing, das Ding, object A. The sublime object is what structures our desire, but also serves as a screen against the abyss of desire, which is to say, against the sublime. In a way, for Lacan, the sublime object is to counter the abyss of Kant. And I'll come back to these specific dynamics at the end of my talk tonight. And so it is that in Žižek's Tarrying with the Negative from 1993, the sublime is an index of the real qua an ethics of the evil. But also, perhaps we can tweak Žižek's discussion of Kant and Sade to provide a figure for Burtynsky. So I'll just throw in, you'll know the words I'm throwing into Žižek's quote here. The sadist is he who enjoys photographing ruin as an instrumentalized bureaucratic duty which reverses and thereby brings to its truth the Kantian sublime, in which we become aware of the suprasensible measure through the chaotic, boundless character of our aesthetic experience, so because of those photographs. In this reading, the sublime in Burtynsky's photographs function as the object A to protect us from the Kantian sublime. 2, in his book For They Know Not What They Do, also from the early 90s, Žižek outlines this antagonism in a way that, for our purposes here, nails Burtynsky because of how, quote, the paradox of the sublime is in the conversion of the impossibility of presentation to the presentation of impossibility. So even if it is impossible to imagine the scale of the Three Gorges Dam or a Utah copper mine in which you could stack 2 Sears towers end upon end, it is nonetheless possible for a photograph to do that work of imaging or imagining for us. That is, in Žižek's reading, the gentrified sublime of Burtynsky's photographs are jaw-dropping comment. See those specks? They're giant trucks. This gentrified sublime is the very protection against the horror of that space, as too would be any literalist environmentalist theory of the tar sand sublime. Or again, even if it is possible to imagine the scale of the New Jersey Turnpike, it is nonetheless possible if it's impossible to imagine that scale, it's nonetheless possible for a photograph to imagine it for us. Or rather, perhaps it is the other way around. If thanks to Robert Smithson, or Tony Soprano, or Juno Diaz, or William Carlos Williams, we can imagine the New Jersey landscape quite well, Burtynsky makes it unimaginable except via his picture. Žižek continues in Enjoy Your Symptom, arguing that with the sublime, as with the senseless real, the subject is never simply absent from it. The very absence, the lack that the brute presence of the real recalls is the subject. Hence the bird's eye view that provides a prosthesis not only for the photographer but the viewer. So this would be the answer to sort of maudlin humanist complaints that you don't see the agency of the worker, you don't see the actual person there, there's no sense of scale and so on. That very lack of scale itself is the place where the subject comes in, the subject as a kind of a void or a lack in sort of Žižek 101. Elsewhere in The Plague of Fantasies, he draws on, drawing on Alenka Zupančič, he reads the Sublime in terms of scale, referring to something from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, which I can't really remember, I mean the movie, that is, in a manner, again, not incommensurable with the infinitesimally small marks on a Burtynsky photograph that will turn out to be workers. Finally, in The Ticklish Subject, he reads Kant's Sublime against Badiou's Event. The distance in the former's discussion of the French Revolution, we can enjoy it because we're not there, savagely critiqued by the latter. And thus, the Sublime indicates the abyss gentrified by reason. 2, Žižek often offers the Sublime indivisible remainder, a version of the thing or object A in his canon, which in the same way contrasts brutally the textbook Kantian Sublime of Hurricane Katrina, in his book Violence, versus, on the one hand, the desublimation of the Marxist Freudian hermeneutics of suspicion and the Lacanian distinction between beauty as the good and the sublime as the superego. Surely then this working out of the sublime turns out to be what is fundamental to Žižek's theoretical practice. How from the beginning he has had to bring not so much Kant avec Sade, a title of Lacan, as Kant avec Lacan, or Lacan le plus sublime, or even between two sublimes, between two sublimes, which is where Žižek finds himself. But I certainly do not want to fall into an orthodox Vancouver school ideology that privileges the warmed-over Marxism of post-conceptual photography over the middle-brow, family-friendly enviro kitsch of Burtynsky. Wouldn't want to do that. Rather, of course, super intimidating, giving a talk on photography in Vancouver, right? B, don't want to just fall into the Team Vancouver kind of sign up to save the Vancouver Art Gallery, that kind of thing. Rather, I want to look at his pictures, Burtynsky's pictures, one last time via discussion of the Sublime in Lacan and Žižek, and with a further degree of specificity. So maybe we go about 5 minutes. In his 7th seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, Lacan talks about visiting his friend, the surrealist poet Jacques Prévert, during World War II. A time of great penitence and belt tightening, as Lacan puts it, under Pétain. Prévert had a collection of matchboxes that went around his apartment, one stuck into the other with what Lacan calls a copulatory force. That is, because the inside of one box, its drawer, is now outside and then inside another, the box, quote, the box of matches is not simply an object, but that, in the form of an Erscheinung, or appearance, as it appeared in its truly imposing multiplicity, it may be a thing, das Ding. Thus, Lacan argues, sublimation, quote, raises an object to the dignity of the thing. So for Lacan, the sublime object has to do with the erotic aspects of the object, the matchboxes fucking each other, and their vertiginous multiplicity, their Kantian disorder. So it is to Kant that Žižek will connect Lacan's sublime object of ideology, discussing first the distinction between beauty and sublimity. Žižek quotes Kant's critique of judgment, where beauty offers us mere pleasure, while, quote, the object is received as sublime with a pleasure that is only possible through the mediation of displeasure. So that's Kant quoted by Žižek. In short, Žižek continues, the sublime is beyond the pleasure principle. It is a paradoxical pleasure produced by displeasure itself. The exact definition, Žižek reminds us, one of the Lacanian definitions of enjoyment or jouissance, which is enjoyment, pleasure and pain together. This mediation of beauty to the sublime is for Kant a matter of an, quote, object of nature, the representation, or Verstellung, of which determines the mind to regard the elevation of nature beyond our reach as equivalent to a presentation, or Darstellung, of ideas. An elevation that Žižek immediately compares to Lacan's raising the object to the dignity of the thing. But here I want to make 2 final qualifications, or additional provisos. The first is that, as Laurie Pauly reminds us with respect to Burtynsky's photography, his work is less concerned with nature qua nature than with a man-made sublime. Indeed, this is from a series called Urban Minds. That is, our effect on nature. The industrial sublime, as John Bentley Mays referred to Burtynsky's work in 1994, or the British Marxist art historian Francis Klingender, who didn't write about Burtynsky but wrote about art in the Industrial Revolution. But again, I think both Burtynsky's own statements and their citation by his critics and the pictorial effect of the photographs themselves render that sublime one of political stasis, of neoliberal quietism and inevitability. Neither capitalist dream nor environmental nightmare, but rather the post-ideological third way. As Pauly writes, quote, he compels us to think of these landscapes as inevitable products of our time. And yet the excremental pollution on view here also reminds us how, for Žižek, the sublime's failure of representation does not, as with Kant, lead to the suprasensible idea, but, quote, the sublime as an object which occupies the place, replaces, fills out the empty place of the thing as the void, as the pure nothing, the absolute negativity. The sublime is an object whose positive body is just an embodiment of nothing. That is, Žižek's negativity is embodied in some disgusting, miserable, radically contingent leftover. At this point, I want to finish with some questions and proposals rather than a conclusion. First of all, I haven't figured out yet how Žižek's Sublime then compares with Benjamin's Optical Unconscious and Aura. Secondly, how do these theoretical concepts, or do they offer better ways of accounting for what is going on in Burtynsky's photographs than the essentially journalistic tropes of the Sublime to be found in the criticism? For Žižek, the Sublime is both the Kantian or Burkean challenge to our perception and that which protects us from that very challenge. It is both the void and the gentrification of the void. As he writes in Enjoy Your Symptom, the lack that the brute presence of the real recalls is the subject. That is to say, the void is the subject. And then to stay with our, okay, if the optical unconscious is that which is revealed by photography as the real or the unconscious of the physical world, as Benjamin argues, revealed through enlargement, through framing, through composition and light, then the aura is the aesthetics of that very framing, composition, and light. And to stay with our last photograph, Žižek argues in The Fragile Absolute that the excremental in art maintains the place of the sacred when beauty is no longer possible. I've used this in an essay on Kelly Wood's Garbage Project. Thus, Duchamp's urinal is a comment on Malevich's Black Square, or the other way around. In this way, the excrement, the social shit that is these tailing ponds in this photograph, in their Rothko-like grandeur, reassure us, in spite of ourselves, that beauty is still around and still useless. But comparisons of Burtynsky to Rothko, Pollock, Serra, Richard Serra, not Santiago Serra, etc., are a dime a dozen, the crystal meth of art criticism. Unless we can say first that Rothko fulfills the promise of Malevich, as Žižek says, then Burtynsky then negates that negation. Thank you. There's a mic. They're taping this.
We have like 15 or 20 minutes for questions. We can probably hear you without the microphone.
Hey, so when you were talking about Benjamin and the fishwife, you characterized him as a ladies' man. And you said that his reading of The Fishwife was therefore problematic. And I was wondering if you could clarify and unpack that a bit for us.
Oh, I just talked about, the gender nature of that reading, right? We want to know her and so on, right? There seemed to be some kind of a heterosexual, kind of masculine sort of desire there. I mean, ladies' man, hardly the worst thing in the world to be called, but I mean, if you read his biography, he was a player of the day, there's always things about his relation with his child and so on. So, and I'm not doing some, kindergarten ethics thing here, but I'm just saying that the way in which I could pull back the quote if we really need me to. but the way in which Žižek or Benjamin talks about, yeah, it fills you with an unruly desire to know what her name was, the woman who was alive there, who even now is still real and will never consent to being wholly absorbed in art. So that unruly desire, I don't know, that to my mind, that seemed somehow engendered in a way. And then, you know, the Flickr comment that I pulled up, right, Gwenny P., who, okay, I'll just assume it's a woman, right? But, you know, nail me to the cross for that one. But she's saying it would be great to see more photos of women from this time, see what their lives were like. That seems to me less about gender in terms of desire, more about gender in a social idea of what were the lives of women like in the 19th century. So.
Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering if you've seen Baraka or the latest Samsara. I know some of the shots in Samsara are similar to
In what movie?
Samsara. It's who shot that? Ron Frick, I think, is the cinematographer. It's like a series of basically stills, some tracking shots, and some other things shot on 70mm, so pretty large format, similar sort of style to Burtynsky. But if you're not familiar, maybe my question won't be very relevant. But I just felt like it was sort of similar, and I was wondering what you thought, whether your concept of the Sublime relates to those films at all. But might be something to.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you can give me the titles later, and I'll
for sure.
I'll check them out. Thanks.
Hi. So you mentioned the emergence, disappearance, and simulation of the aura. And so I'm interested in hearing about the simulation aspect, kind of the re-emergence of the aura, and how that possibly connects to this production of the sublime, whether capitalistic or photographic.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the first part, and another long footnote that I didn't, which actually I pulled out of an essay I wrote on Miroslav Tichy, the Czech or Czech photographer from the 70s and the 80s, who would make his own cameras and everything, and he'd do these really, they had a show of his at Presentation House a few years ago, really grimy kind of weird photos, but of 1960s and 70s Czech communist women sunbathing. So, you know, what's not to like? And here's what I said about that simulation of the aura at that point. So expressed crudely, the history of photography is a history of the triumph of the objective photograph, straight photography, over the pictorial. As an art movement, pictorialism refers to a tendency in art in the late 19th century into the 1930s. Photographers would pose their subjects or shoot scenes with reference to art historical conventions and composition. Two, they would often manipulate the negative or use development processes from photogravure to gum bichromate prints that would soften or otherwise alter the image. They're trying to make them look like paintings, soft focus paintings. Again, you know, the Instagram of the time, right? Pictorialism can be seen as an attempt on the part of art photographers to separate their work both from the rapid explosion in hobbyists and from the camera's unforgiving accuracy. So some names: Henry Peach Robinson, Robert Damashi, George Davidson, perhaps also Edward Curtis, right? Just me think about him in terms of Marie Clements, who's doing some work right now at SFU, were early progenitors. Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz were the 20th century's best-known practitioners. In the 20s and 30s, however, the new Sachlichkeit or new objectivity movement in Weimar Germany and the turn towards straight or pure photography in the work of such artists as Strand, Atget, Sander, Walker Evans affected another reversal, and the documentary style became a dominant form. And I think from the way I was talking about earlier, I mean, in effect, pictorialism was the photoconceptualism of the day, in the sense that whereas photoconceptualism in some ways, beyond just in a quick and dirty version of, say, a Jeff Wall photograph that looks like street photography but isn't. It's faked. In the same way, pictorialism, and you know, now with all the digital processing to do and so on, in the same way, pictorialism was using all this processing to try to look like paintings. And in the same way, again, photo or post-conceptual photography will emulate art historical forms, and that as a movement of cultural capital, right? To gain that cultural capital from art history. But the second part was about the Sublime and capitalism.
That production of the sublime, whether, and obscuring that sublime. So in the same way that there's this pictorial resurgence to bring this art historical context of the painterly or whatever, and we're seeing this, these natural landscapes brought up to this subliminal, or this sublime level through the industrial acts on that land, or through Burtynsky's views, you know, and wide scales of this land. Just whether there's connections between those approaches of bringing this content out of a photograph that's not necessarily there.
Yeah, because I mean, like, a big deal is made of the fact that, you know, when you know Burtynsky's work, you know he would never dye it, he would never change the color. This is the actual color, but it's not the actual color, it's the color that a photograph through a lens would make of, I'm not, yes, you know, it's polluted, it was some kind of red or whatever it is, but there's a kind of a documentary claim to what Burtynsky's work is doing, right? But it's also an aestheticization of that industrial effect onto the landscape itself. And where I would try to do a more kind of orthodox Marxist reading in the way that Benjamin does, but Benjamin's saying that aura in people sitting for photographs in the late 19th century, in the 1880s and 1890s, the portrait photography, not the early daguerreotypes, but a bit later, the aura then in the folds of the cloth, in the cravat, and so on, comes from a meeting of this rising bourgeois class to the technology of the camera at that time. In the same way, what we have here is a meeting of a despoiled nature, which is, it's a done deal. Right, it's happened. You know, we've got the pile and pile of oil filters. Right, we've got the turnpike. We've got the smashed up this, that, or the other. We've got the tailings ponds and so on. Right, it's a done deal. It's not about changing it. Or I was talking with Michael Turner about this. Ian Wallace, who will have a show opening at the Vancouver Art Gallery later this month. His clay pot protest photographs are, in a sense, documenting people trying to stop a landscape from becoming a Burtynsky photograph, right? But Burtynsky's just showing what happened, right? And the inevitability of that. And so that done deal, that post-ideological third way kind of way of reading it would be where I would go with that. Thank you for the question.
Questions?
I really enjoyed this, Clint. I was struck especially by your discussion of the technical aspects of Burtynsky's photo setups, and especially the aerial or three-quarters view. There's something about that that orientation and the etymology behind the orient or orientation, which actually comes from the Latin oriri, which means to rise, right?
Ah, nice.
And obviously, there's something about that that's aestheticizing, and it's funny that he uses topographical maps, since that's arguably the perspective that he's attempting to attain, this sort of map-like perspective on a objectified landscape or topography. I also wonder if there's an ultimate connection back to the Earthrise photograph that in '68 sort of objectified the Earth itself at the most distant scale possible at that time. And two things seem to happen.
From one of the Apollo missions?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, taken from the orbit of the moon. And it's sort of credited with the beginning of environmentalism, with its coincidence with Rachel Carson's book. And so it figured the Earth as an object when it hadn't really been conceived of that way before. But each of these successive portraits of the Earth from this perspective do sort of two things at once that seem to speak to your argument. They purport to show that our Earth is so fragile and isolated and floating there unprotected in the void, but the Earth also looks beautiful and blue and unspoiled. Is there sort of a dialectic, or is that another example of this dialectic that you point out that seems to inhere in scale itself, or in this zooming out, in this case at a sort of extrapolated, distant planetary position?
So the scale is the second part. The first part is by reifying it, making it into something beautiful. Then that, I mean, because your argument would be that yes, it made possible by thinking of the Earth itself as this fragile blue thing. On the one hand, let's protect it, let's save it. and so on, but not really that blue thing. Let's save things that we need, right? You know, like oxygen, right? You know, the Earth doesn't need oxygen, we need oxygen, and other animals do, and so on, right? And plants do. So that it kicked off the environmental thing versus that it just makes it into an aesthetic object. But also, I think it does both those things, and I think Burtynsky does both those things in that he's, even when we look at a photograph of his and it's of something ugly but with a grandeur at the same time, I guess what I want to think about is the aesthetics is not just something that means there's no politics possible. I don't think just making something into an aesthetic object means that we've given up the political ghost. We have to see it in a more utilitarian or functional or instrumental way, protect it, and so on, right? That notion of environmentalism, that when we have an aesthetic object, that it's not even, we have to get rid of that idea that because he's not telling us what to think, that's why it's art. That just seems like 1942 or something. Like, really, like, and the critics keep saying this, right? I mean, they're writing, well, I mean, no one's writing about him in smart places, I guess, or something like this, but, you know, they're writing in these books or his iPad app or whatever, and they're saying, you know, he doesn't tell you what to think, and it's not simply environmentalist, but it's not just an apology for, but is that all there is in terms of nuance that we can possibly have, right? Maybe because it's, and that's where I stopped at one point with, oh, it's just this middle brow, Sublime and so on. But no, then I thought, well, I don't want to just rest with this easy poo-poo. Like when I mentioned I was writing about this to a senior Vancouver artist who I won't mention, he, because all the senior ones are he said to me, why? You know, why should you should write about us, not about that guy who just has, you know, big books out and goes, you know, mainstream kind of galleries, right? You should write about the important artists. But I think, but at that point I wanted to write about it to kick it to the curb. But then I'm thinking, well, fuck that. Like, no, there's something in there. It's not, it's in the aesthetic thing that's going on in the work itself that tells us something about not who we are as people on the earth in that kind of Greenpeace-ish kind of way, but that does something to what it means in terms of our subjectivity that we can't orient to it, right? We have the illusion we're rising above it, right? We have the illusion that you know, that we're not part of you know, Three Gorges, right? It's the Chinese who are wasting the earth, who have their environmental despoilation and so on, right? Not us, you know, Vancouverites, right? So we have that kind of illusion, but actually when we see the shot like that, which, you know, is doing the fog on the river kind of 19th century Sublime, Hudson Valley even sort of, or Turner, right, kind of thing here, right? But oh, it's, you know, those are containers or whatever they are up close, right? And if you have the iPad thing again, you can pinch and all that kind of thing, right? And you look at it more closely, right? But there's something else going on with that desire to look at it, and what looking at it is, that's an aesthetic project that's worth talking about as an aesthetic project and not just jumping to some kind of, Kevin, Vancouver Sun-ready headline, right? But instead to dwell on that aesthetic thing itself, and that there's a politics of that.
Since you mentioned Greenpeace, a really quick follow-up. There's a Greenpeace film called Petropolis.
Oh, right. And I've heard that's quite amazing.
Yeah, I recommend it if you haven't seen it. And what is interesting and troubling about it, I think, although I really like it on its own terms, whereas here you've critiqued Burtynsky in this dialectical way as in terms of something that inheres in his particular perspective, his particular technical approach. What you have there is a film that ostensibly is directly trying to make an environmental, ecological argument, and yet they end up with something that is still, maybe despite itself, an aesthetic object, which is still quite beautiful to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, and I saw the 2-minute clip for it on YouTube, and there was the way in which it was there, like, you only have to see, right? As though if we can just see it. And yet, friends of mine at this conference saying they took their students at one point to Fort Mac, and they flew over it. And the students were really kind of, they'd done all this work about environmentalism and so on, but they're really kind of let down that it wasn't uglier, right? They wanted the money shot, right? They wanted that total tar pit look, the tailings pond, right? You know, no, Burtynsky, you know, he took like 1,000 photographs before he got that one, right? And so, you know, yeah.
We can actually stop it right there then, I guess.
Thanks very much,
Okay,
everyone.
so thank you very much, Clint.